I'm pretty sure that that went as well as can be expected. So now we are in chapter 4 of Darkbreakers, book 1, The Breaker Queen. Chapter 4 is called Wind and Fire. I'm excited about this chapter because you get to meet Anna, and I love Anna. But that's a spoiler, so yeah. Oh, by the way, okay, so I know people are different. And I am different than some people in that I don't really have a spoiler thing. I have what I call a spicer thing because I like it when people tell me what's about to happen in a story. It just makes it more interesting to me. And I know that there's always exceptions to rules. Like, it would have been an exception to the rule if somebody had told me the end of, like, The Sixth Sense or something. Maybe they did. But I sort of looked forward to it because I get, like, nervous about plot stuff. What's going to happen? What's going to happen next? And sometimes that keeps people reading. But for me, it sort of makes me almost too anxious sometimes to read or to watch. But if I know a plot element, that's like one thing that I'm paying attention to. And I don't have to pay attention to being surprised or jump scared. I can pay attention to what's going on in the writing or the acting or the sets or all of the Gesamtkunstwerk, which word I don't know how to pronounce exactly. Like all of the rest of the art that goes into making something. Like the structure of a plot interests me. So seeing how it is written and how it plays out is interesting to me. But like not the actual thing, if that makes sense. Anyway, so I call them spicers because knowing what's about to happen gives me a little frisson of like happiness and interest. So I will try not to spoil anything for you. I know spoilers far outnumber spicers, though I have met a few other ones. But I get excited and then I just want to talk about things. But in the meantime, you're not here for that. You're here for chapter 4 of Darkbreakers book 1, The Breaker Queen. Chapter 4 is called Wind and Fire. The dining room was larger than the faculty cafeteria at Seafall University where Eliot worked. Its walls and floors were dark polished wood. Marble pillars rose majestically to frescoed ceilings. The radius windows were framed in sumptuous velvet, as lasciviously scarlet as demon tongues. The crystal stemware was hand-engraved. The translucent bone porcelain was enameled in elaborate patterns of birds and berries, and above the massive table hung 3 gilt bronze waterfall chandeliers, each bigger than Eliot's bathroom. There were also gentry babes everywhere. Wherever a tubby-bottomed, stump-winged, round-bellied, dimple-cheeked gentry babe could conceivably be stuck, or suspended or fastened or plastered, pinioned, bas-reliefed or clumped like a bunch of leering grapes, there it was. Often it was just a head, curly-horned, apple-cheeked, and grinning with gold-leaf eyes. Gentry babes were a major theme of illusionist art. Illusionists loved to remind you that the 3-petal world flower was shattered, that the worlds were separate and would remain separate, that there were boundaries you could not cross. Illusionist artists painted ceilings that looked like skies, just to remind you that they were ceilings. They painted walls to look like bowers and floors to look like pools. In this way, to Eliot's mind at least, illusionist art was always beautiful and always slightly disappointing. If those were flowers, where was the perfume? If that was a pool, where were the depths? If the ceiling was the sky, where was the rain that fell, the stars that shone? He was dissatisfied with the answer, which was always apart, divorced, discreet. Thus with gentry babes. First of all, everybody knew they didn't actually exist. In bygone areas, yes, perhaps humans cavorted with gentry, some willingly, some not so much. The same way humans cavorted with each other. And yes, perhaps from those unions in an era long, long ago, there might have resulted offspring. Children of both worlds, and neither. Children apart. Sex imps, some said. Demons, said others. Eliot had always been in sympathy with the demi-heroes of those gentry tales. Gentry babes could see through the boundaries between worlds, but could not cross them. Gentry babes were strangers everywhere, welcome nowhere. But conversely, and here was what fascinated Eliot, they belonged everywhere, were strangers nowhere. Perhaps they had no need of secret ways between the worlds. Perhaps they were those ways. When a voluptuist painted a gentry babe, when Eliot painted one, he rarely depicted it as illusionists did as a child. And never just the head alone. A voluptuist's gentry babe might be a surly teenager trying to hide his unbiddable tale. A young mother finding the tears she weeps when her lover abandons her and her child are nuggets of brightest, purest palladium. It might be a grinning politician with gold-leaf eyes, a raggedy clown with wings at her ankles and wrists, a traveler with fish scales along their thighs, with webbed fingers and a scarred mouth wearing a pack on their back. A voluptuist's gentry babe was always going places, searching for others like them. But the gentry babes of Breaker House's dining room were wall-stuck. Nothing but heads and curlicues. They regarded Eliot curiously, as if deciding whether to strike up a conversation. To discourage them, he tore his gaze away. He was still reeling from his uncanny encounter in the library. He could not bear another. Not now. Not in front of witnesses. His limbs tingled, especially the sockets of his shoulders and hips. There the tingling drew in and balled up, forming tight spheres of glowing anticipation. The hair on his arms stood on end. Midnight is the breaking hour. Any door will do. Focus, Howell, Eliot muttered. If he was this distractible at a small family dinner, how much worse would he be at the big party in 2 days' time, when Miss Desdemona Mannering turned 25 and the world rang out the news? He needed to concentrate. He needed to stroll about the dining room, examining the art on the walls, all portraits of Mannering ancestors, like cardinal points on some colossal compass, and composing himself before the others arrived. He needed to... Is that an Ilar Qureshi original? His voice echoed in the empty room, startling him. Eliot hurried, not strolled, to examine the painting. He'd only seen a few Qureshi pieces in his life, all of them at the Seafall Museum of Fine Arts, and the famous one, of course, on the ceiling of the Opera House. 7 hells swallow him. It was enormous. It was like fingernails dragging lightly down his scalp. It was like a razor opening his belly. It was like thorns and roses summer-timing out from under his skin. His body swayed. Eloise at the edge of the world, proclaimed the brass plaque at the bottom of the ornate frame. Pardon me? For today's recording, I broke out the fancy goblet. Eliot had studied Eloise at university, a hand-colored photographic print of it anyway. He taught Eloise to his students, devoting a whole unit to the rich tonality of its palette, the anatomical accuracy of its lone figure, her damp, clinging dress revealing everything, her body forever torqued for that eternal, elusive glimpse over her shoulder, the smoky transition from gloom to radiance, the dimensionality and depth and mystery evoked by the contrast of sharp lines and the out-of-focus plane. And now here she was, Eloise, almost a living thing right in front of him. The painting was described in art history books as a dark-skinned lady in a dress of pale lace, leaning with her back against a balcony, looking over her shoulder and out across a stormy sea. It wasn't like that, of course. It was exactly like that, of course. Eliot shivered, agitated. If Eloise turned away from the sea and stared at him now, would her face be covered in tattoos? Would all the starry midnight shine in her whiteless eyes? The gentry babes could probably tell him. They wanted to. They strained against their alabaster panels, leaned out from their marble corbels, eager to whisper secrets. Elliot stumbled back. He didn't want to. He wanted to fling himself forward and into the painting. Barring that, he wished to flee this resplendent room, dash upstairs and scrape his current canvas clean, and then burn it, or rend it to pieces like Gideon did with his sculptures. How could he, standing in the direct beam of Qureshi's Eloise, judge himself worthy of painting another Mannering woman standing on that same balcony of Breaker House, looking out to that same sea? He could not. No matter what Miss Desdemona Mannering wanted, he was unworthy to hold a bristle brush. He should go back home and paint houses and repair roofs like his da before him. He was not looking behind him as he backed up, and so he backed right up into Annalise Field. She laughed as he flailed and put two strong hands on his back and righted him. "Hello, Elliot. I didn't see you in the drawing room, so I came to find you." "Hello, Anna. What happened? Did something frighten you?" Her voice was sympathetic. She understood how sensitive he could be. "Yes," he said simply. "Was it that Epern?" Anna stepped out from behind him to point out the metastasized silver centerpiece on the table. It had 4 arms, 4 legs, and half a dozen bowls, dishes, and candle holders, as well as an enormous basket. "I'm tempted to glue a few googly eyes to it," she confessed. "It would make the most marvelous little hobgoblin, don't you think?" She dropped her voice, adding a bit of gravel to it. "Hello, I'm Basketful, the Baleful. Tithe me 1/10 of your milk each morning, and I'll trade you for your heart's desire." Now Elliot laughed. "That sounds like a character in one of your books." Anna spread her hands in a shrug. "It may yet be." Elliot squinted at the Epern. It winked back, even without googly eyes. He blinked. "An Epern again, just an Epern. I don't think," he said uneasily, "that we should truck with the Koboldkin. Not even in jest. Not in this house." "Oh," Anna said cheerfully, "I bet they're not as bad as the stories say." "Your stories say they eat gentry for breakfast." "Sure they do, when they aren't boinking them. But who are we to judge? We humans are all appetite. Look, we have 10,000 different utensils just to eat things with." She gestured to the sparkling place settings that lined the long table. "You know, Elliot," she reflected, "where I come from, we have 1 fork, 1 spoon, 1 knife. Maybe 2 knives, if it's steak. You?" Elliot smiled down at Annalise, his rescuer. Anna, dear Anna, snatching him back from the jaws of enchantment. Her friendly hand on his arm had wiped the smirk off every gentry babe's face, making all those winking goblin eyes disappear. Now Eloise would never turn in her picture frame to show him her face. "Alas." "Utensils?" Elliot asked mildly. "What are those? According to my ma, we kids all just dove in our troughs like hogs. If we had company, we maybe got a mite more civilized, even went so far as to eat with our hands, but we didn't wash first." "Are we related? Because you sound an awful lot like my brothers." "It is my lifelong ambition to be named an honorary field," Elliot replied, marveling at her glorious Anna-ness. He was aware that she considered herself a plain woman. She referred to her figure as lumpy, her features as unexceptional. Her scoliosis gave her rounded shoulders. Her formidable intelligence gave her a perpetually thoughtful, if slightly worried, forehead. Elliot thought her remarkable, a shining being. If Miss Desdemona Mannering's beauty was that of a tigress, Anna's was more elemental, more soul-stirring, like a midsummer bonfire among friends who were soon to be parted, like a late autumn windstorm, one that strips the last blazing leaves from the copper beech trees, bearing their branches to winter's beauty. Last year, on his request, Anna had sat for her portrait. Elliot called it Writer at Work. In it she was barefoot, dressed in flannel pajamas and a ludicrously long red scarf her father had knitted for her. ever the voluptuist, Eliot had depicted the scarf as a crimson serpent, looped dotingly around Anna's neck, coiling all around and down her body until it unfurled in an obedient heap at her feet. To sustain such a long pose over a series of sittings, Eliot had asked Anna to assume whatever position you find most conducive to page count. So she had curled up in the window seat of her garret apartment, feet against the wall, notebook on knees, pen in mouth. The serpent's wedge-shaped head rested on her shoulder, reading along. Sunlight shone through the window glass, sparking flames from the serpent's scales, tongues of fire from Anna's curly red hair. Eliot had taken painstaking care to render a ghostly reflection of those blazing tints in the glass. Writer at Work, Eliot's most ambitious painting up to that point, was the centerpiece of his first and only show at a rinky-dink gallery called The Finger, located in the heart of the Shank, Seafall's rundown arts district. He'd sold absolutely nothing at the show, except for that portrait. An anonymous patron had purchased it, then turned around and donated it to Smunka, the Seafall Museum of New Century Art. Apparently, the donation came with a substantial grant, also anonymous, earmarked for the creation of a voluptuous wing, on the condition that Writer at Work be exhibited year-round. When Kavi, the art dealer who owned The Finger, told Eliot about the transaction, he'd been ecstatic. He wrote to his mother that his career was made. She wrote back, "That's nice, El," and included 3 pairs of knitted socks. Months later, Smunka was still dragging its feet about the new construction. The money from the painting had deliquesced, one of his new socks needed darning, and Eliot himself was wondering if gracefully surrendering to obscurity would be better than breaking his fingers on the hard scrabble of hope. The sooner he quit painting and focused on finding work that paid more than an adjunct's pittance, the sooner he could stop agonizing every month over which bills to prioritize. Choosing between groceries, utilities, rent, and school debt often left him without coal for heat, ice for the icebox, canned food for the cupboard, and any article of clothing in his wardrobe that wasn't mostly patches and safety pins. He might have given it all up, had not Miss Desdemona Mannering caught him drawing one afternoon on Alderwood Wharf 8 months ago. "Oh, do you sketch tourists? That's just deevy. Sketch me." "Are you a tourist?" "No, Snookums. Lived in Seafall all my life. Sketch a girl, anyway." He'd done a quick charcoal, capturing her snapping eyes and haughty smile and confident beauty with a few sure strokes. But she'd shaken her head at it, insisting, "Sketch me like you did the other one. That drawing you hid when I startled you. The one with all those funny little faces." Eliot had been roughing out a little fancy of his, a group of rich young shoppers tumbling out the door of one of those expensive, exclusive stores built up along the old fish market. What made the sketch voluptuous was the content. Though Eliot's rich young shoppers were spiffed up in the latest Seafall fashions, all of them polished, pomaded, pompadoured, and dressed to impress an empress, these shoppers were not rich young humans. Some had butterfly faces, some had scoots or scales, others sprouted mushrooms, others were moss-furred, clover-haired, others had jewels for eyes. What made the work voluptuous, as opposed to illusionist, was that the goblins and gentry in Eliot's sketch were walking around the human world like they had every right to be there. No walls, no boundaries, no question of belonging. The 3-petal world flower was whole again. So, at Miss Desdemona Mannering's insistence, Eliot took back his sketch of a wealthy young woman laden with a day's worth of shopping, and then he weirded it. He added bizarre, shadowy figures everywhere, peeping out from her bags, peering over her bandboxes, swinging from the brim of her hat, and clinging to the handle of her clutch purse. They tried to camouflage themselves amongst the chaos of shoes and chapeaux and garments she had just purchased, but whatever their disguise, it was never enough. Nothing could quite hide those Long eyes, those long ears, the ruffs of fur, the fans of feathers, the rills, the wings, the forked tongues, the fangs, the horns, the hooves, the spikes. And the young woman's charcoal shadow? Why, it was not the shadow of a woman at all. It was too slinking, too sly. It sported besides a profusion of tails, and at least 2 more ears than was strictly necessary. "That's it! That's exactly right!" proclaimed Miss Desdemona Mannering, snatching the sketch back and tipping Elliot so obscenely that he knew he'd be living off the amount for the rest of his summer holiday. "I tell you, Chaz is going to wet himself. Say, do you have a card, Snookums?" And then she had commissioned a portrait of herself in oils to be finished by her autumn birthday. Something like Eloise, you know, that old painting, something with me in the sea in a white dress and all that. And all that, Elliot murmured to himself, snorting, something like Eloise indeed. When he told Gideon about that encounter, his friend surprised him by barking out a laugh. Sounds like the Desdemonster, all right. It came out that the 2 of them were cousins. Desdemona Mannering's mother, Tracy Mannering, had been born an Alderwood. Her brother, Lance Alderwood, had married an Audrey Beckett, Gideon's mother. Until that moment, Elliot had no idea Gideon came from money. He certainly didn't live like it. Anna booped his nose, calling his name. "Elliot, you're a million miles away. Where are you?" Elliot blinked himself back to the present. He was sorry to see that Anna's anxious brow was looking more anxious than usual on his behalf. She loved him. She accepted his occasional absent while still standing in front of you moments. She, better than anyone, could keep a companionable silence for hours. But still, sometimes she worried. "The real question," Elliot asked softly, "is not where I am, but why am I here at all? And what have I to do with—" He gestured around them. "All this?" Annalise's sudden smile bloomed in warm understanding. "I know what you mean. That table is bigger than my whole garret, including the bathroom I'm forced to share with Gideon. It makes me feel—" She did not finish, but did not have to. Elliot understood her perfectly. It made her feel small, unworthy, ugly, old before her time, insignificant, poor, diminished. Taking her hand, he stroked the ink stains on her fingers and told her, "You're here because your best-selling debut novel launched you into the new century glitterati and right into Miss Mannering's loving embrace. I'm here to paint the impossible, to finish a portrait meant to cast Ilar Quareshi's Eloise into the drowning deeps." He laughed in outright disbelief to hear those words aloud. "Gideon is here to make sure I don't steal the silverware." Annalise's gaze flickered to something behind him. Elliot glanced over his shoulder. They were no longer alone in the dining room. Gideon, Chaz, and H. Mannering stood together by the fireplace, sipping rum flips and conversing. Elliot and Anna, standing under Eloise at the opposite side of the room, were well out of eavesdropping range if they kept their voices low. Never a problem for Elliot. He turned back to her. "Oh, Anna, no. Gideon doesn't, he isn't—" "He acts like it," Anna said fiercely. "Yesterday when I arrived, he looked like he wanted to pick me up and put me out the door again. I think—" Words began to burble up in him. Words Elliot knew would sound like nonsense, the kind of words his mother would have told him to swallow, lest speaking them would summon trouble. They came out anyway. They always did. "I think he's here to protect us." "Protect us? From what?" "From the walls," Elliot thought, but did not say. "From the house." He wanted to point out the gentry babes, the impossible portraits, the daunting silverware, the goblin épergne. He wanted to tell Anna about the maid in the library with her startling hair and midnight eyes and the moon in her mouth. But that danger, at least, he would walk into willingly. And he didn't want Anna to worry any more than she already did, so Elliot shrugged his shoulders, which seemed to have grown shoulders of their own. They were so cumbersome and heavy, and said, "I don't know. He won't say. But Gideon's clearly afraid of something, and he's afraid for you most of all. Annalise scoffed. Gideon isn't afraid of anything except his own sculptures. They both turned then and leaned against each other, looking over at their dour friend. He was slumped against the gentry babe festooned marble mantelpiece, saying nothing, his wiry arms crossed tightly over his chest. The frown he directed at the floor was so scorching, Elliot was surprised the hardwood did not blister under the heat of it. H.H. would be talking politics, Chaz would be baiting him, but delicately, artfully, with all the flexibility of a fencer and the dexterity of a dragonfly. H.H. would never even suspect he was being mocked. No, the genius of it was, he'd think Chaz was agreeing with everything he said. After all, was not Charles Abelard Mallistar the only son of Rock Common Mallistar, firmly under his father's omnipotent thumb? As firmly as H.H. believed his only daughter to be under his? H.H. Mannering was by no means a stupid man, but he was not a subtle one. He controlled Candletown Coal Company. He owned stock in rails and shipping throughout the Federation Islands and was a major shareholder in multiple businesses on the southern Laressa mainland. He divided his time between his 5 estates and as his schedule demanded. Breaker House was his summer cottage, the least of his mansions, with its alabaster columns, 70-something rooms, and 30,000 or so terracotta roof tiles. He was Desdemona's father, Gideon's uncle, and as far as Elliot could tell, a deep-dyed brute. Phrases such as labor legislation and bleeding hearts rose and fell from the far side of the room, until H.H.'s bandsaw of a voice spiked on goddamn liberal conspiracy to hike wages. Gideon's head shot up like a mishandled marionette's. He stared at his uncle with such angry incredulity that Elliot was surprised H.H. did not combust on the spot. You know what I heard, Harlan? Chaz purred before Gideon could say anything. I heard that liberals eat their babies. It sounded so far-fetched, but now I don't know. What do you say? Do you lend credence to this scurrilous scuttlebutt? Elliot smiled as Chaz's sibilance went positively serpentine. H.H. snorted, amused, but not for the same reasons. Wouldn't be surprised. They have so many of them. Bending his head to Anna's ear, Elliot whispered, that look on Gideon's face, positively lupine. Anna's laugh was mirthless. What can you expect? He was raised by wolves. Then sighing, she turned away from the object of their conversation, hunching her shoulders against him as if against a raw salt wind. Elliot slung an arm around her shoulders and squeezed. He often wondered at the fraught relationship between his 2 best friends. Any moment he felt he might be shimmering towards some kind of enlightenment. Gideon did something to shatter his suspicions. He couldn't help feeling that both Gideon and Annalise would have been far happier had they never met, much less shared rented neighboring flats in the same cramped garret, much less shared a bathroom. Well, Anna might have been happier. Elliot had never actually seen Gideon happy. And yet, he could sometimes almost imagine it, what Gideon's happiness would look like. Usually when Anna's back was turned, when he caught Gideon watching her from the corner of his eye, thinking himself unobserved, like he was doing now. But the arrival of Miss Desdemona Mannering and Countess Lupe Valeska interrupted further revelations. Elliot removed his arm from Annalise's shoulders, offering her his elbow instead. She slipped her hand into the crook of his arm, and he squeezed it again, both in reassurance and in warning. Obediently, Anna plastered on her sunshiniest smile and allowed him to steer her across the dining room to greet the newcomers. Seeing them approach, the Countess, dripping gems and trailing furs, immediately detached herself from Desdemona and silked over to H.H. She contoured her body to his, lifted her red mouth to his ear, and whispered something that made him laugh derisively. Miss Desdemona Mannering, however, had a different trajectory. "Darlings!" she cried, and flung herself at Annalise and Elliot, trusting them to catch her. They did, not daring to do otherwise. Laughing, Miss Desdemona Mannering kissed Anna full on the mouth. Then she turned in their tangle of arms until just Elliot was holding her, and lingered there, pressing close, pressing her cheek to his, imprinting a phantom of jasmine upon his skin. Her throat gleamed with gold and amber, her fingers with tiger's eye and topaz. Her bouffant bun was a cloud of night, her skin as petal soft as her satin evening gown. The rich, heavy material was so close a match to her golden brown skin that its shining folds and clinging draperies left Elliot with an impression of opulent nudity. "Do you like my gown, Professor Howell?" she cooed. Miss Desdemona Mannering was similar in coloring to her cousin Gideon, with her sable-black hair and eyes, eyelashes thick as bullion fringes, and somewhat villainous eyebrows. "It's an Hernanda. They're my favorite designer. The greatest designer in Seafall." Chaz, still pretending to listen to H.H., guffawed, then cleared his throat to cover the noise. Angling his head to Desdemona, he opened his mouth as if to argue, but H.H., resentful of any loss of attention, grew suddenly more gesticulatory, waving his hands about and raising his voice. Sending a side smirk to Desdemona, Chaz opened his wide, round, blue eyes even wider and fixed them soulfully on H.H.'s face. Elliot didn't know Hernanda from the next Grand Couturier, but he could see that Desdemona's gown was indeed a work of art, and told her so. She laughed in his face, for no reason. Perhaps Elliot thought ruefully, just to confuse him. "Are my artists happy?" She glanced from Elliot to Annalise with one of her feral smiles. "Do they have something yummy to drink? Are refills in order? Gracious, how ferocious Cousin Gideon looks. Is Daddy bitching about unions again? What a bloodbath! Dear me, what is that on Gideon's jacket? Oh, plaster, of course. Poor boy." She rolled her eyes. Her eyes were a black that glittered, Elliot thought, whereas Gideon's smoldered and flashed. But did that glitter conceal shallowness or depth? He could never decide. Elliot found it hard to despise anyone who loved his paintings, but Miss Desdemona Mannering's presence, despite the perfume, the kisses, the solicitude, never failed to make him want to go on a long, lonely walk on the mainland moors that begat him. For this reason he always tried to think of her by her full name. He did not want, even in his thoughts, to be lulled into a false sense of intimacy with someone just as likely to bat his face off with an idle paw as to gather him into an embrace. Now Miss Desdemona Mannering linked her arm through Annalise's and herded her over to the fireplace. No one there looked welcoming, except for Chaz. Chaz was looking as impish as a gentry babe. "So, dearest Lise," Desdemona inquired, "how many chapters did you write today?" Annalise tried for a blithe reply, but sounded guilty and chastened instead. "I didn't write at all, I'm afraid. First I walked around your grounds, then I took the cliff walk all the way to the Silver Bridge. It looks like the path used to keep going on from there, but there is still some damage from a recent storm." "Not recent," Chaz said. "Hurricane Agonath." Anna shivered. "I remember that. Was it 2 years ago already? All those lives. All those trees." H.H. growled. "All those telegraph lines, the gasworks, the waterworks, City Hall, trees," he muttered, sending Anna a glare that clearly conveyed his wish that she had been renting rooms in one of the hundreds of buildings the great wave destroyed. Like Elliot, she and Gideon did in fact live in the middle of the Shank, a run-down section of Seafall close to the water that had suffered the worst damage from Hurricane Agonath. But their apartment building was at the top of a hill and had survived the storm. Anna, withering under H.H.'s contempt, turned the color of canned tomatoes. But Desdemona didn't let her squirm away to take shelter with Elliot. She just cuddled her close, tickling her ribs with fingers that were more topaz and ruby than flesh. "I adore the cliff walk. A breathtaking promenade, isn't it? Daddy just had our part of it repaved last spring." "I had a beautiful walk," Anna said, grateful for the subject change. "Very refreshing. I've been getting appallingly sedentary. "Hazards of the job, Snookums," Desdemona said, smiling. "Really, part of me hopes you'll just grow barnacles and attach to your desk chair just so long as you keep writing. I want your next novel dedicated to me, inspired by your stay at Breaker House." Gideon, who had turned away to face the mantelpiece, now stuck a thumbnail into one gentry babe's gold-painted eye and dug in. Elliot flinched in surreptitious sympathy, rubbing his own eye. "What if, Des," asked Gideon, not looking up from his vandalism, "Miss Field never writes again? It's been known to happen, especially after an early success. Her first novel sold more copies than Adventures of a Courtesan Assassin. Miss Field might feast off her royalties until she dies, dedicating whatever is left to the maintenance of her shrine, where she will lie in state, embalmed and entombed amongst the greatest literary minds of the new century, under a carved monument proclaiming her corpse Annalise Field, authoress." Desdemona giggled. Chaz and the Countess tittered together, their artificial tones harmonizing so precisely that Elliot suspected Chaz of trying to skewer Lupe's mockery with his own. H.H. merely rolled his eyes and rang for a refill of his rum flip. Annalise disengaged her arm from Desdemona's grasp at the same moment that Gideon let his thumb fall from the gentry babe's desecrated eyeball. She stepped toward him as he turned to face her, almost like a dance. Elliot fought the urge to move between them, to join that dance. He knew from experience that intervening in their fights was like stepping bodily between two cannons. The cannons couldn't care less. It was you who ended up with a hole in your chest. "Better to die like that?" Annalise spat. "Better to die celebrated and remembered than bitter and alone. No good works behind you, no friends to mourn you, no mark on 8th but a scratch in the dirt where they buried you." "Is that the premise of your next book?" Gideon's black eyes were half-lidded, intent. Disdain dripped from his words, but his expression was stone. "How very modern, Miss Field. Mother will love it. Mind you, she won't read it, but she'll pass it along to her publisher friends, who'll give you $500,000 in advance and all the publicity you could never stomach, just like last time." "I didn't ask you to give my first book to your mother." Annalise's cheeks were drained of their bright, hectic red. Her freckles stood out stark against her pallor. "I didn't know what you intended when you asked to read it. It wasn't even a finished draft. It wasn't ready. I wasn't ready." Gideon spread his hands. "Ready or not, here you are." Annalise snatched Desdemona's rum flip from her fingers and dashed the contents onto Gideon's face. Creamy brown liquid dripped down onto the fraying shoulders of his frock coat, spicing the air with nutmeg and cinnamon. "I was invited." Tears were streaming down Annalise's face. "Damn you, Gideon, I was invited." "Uninvite yourself." Gideon's voice was like sleet falling. "Breaker House is not for you." Annalise fled the room. Into the ensuing silence, Chaz drawled, "Gracious me, I'd say it was time for dinner, wouldn't you?" His blue eyes flashed to Elliot as if to ask, "Why didn't you stop that?" Elliot was so shocked and sick he couldn't even shake his head in hopeless confusion. The Countess loosed another of her titters. "Oh my, yes please, and let us pray we have no more such displays." "Don't know where you find 'em, Desi," H.H. rumbled to his daughter. "Well, I know where he came from." He jutted his chin at Gideon, who had walked to the table for a napkin and was wiping his face. "The Alderwoods always ran eccentric. Did you know?" H.H. asked the Countess, offering his arm to escort her to the table. "Tracy once fancied herself a pianist. A whole Alderwood fortune spent on tutors, but her sense of rhythm is rotten, just foul. Ask Desi." The Countess glanced inquiringly at Desdemona. For a moment Elliot saw what the glitter in Desdemona's dark eyes usually kept concealed. The sharks that circled there. But all she said was, "The sad truth, darlings, Mother is much better suited to bugle or drums than the piano. She needs something martial, you know, something we can all march to. Something," she mused, "that goes well with banners and slogans like 'Workers, awaken!' and 'Bosses, beware!' that sort of thing." "One day," a scowling H.H. interrupted, I sat Tracy down and laid it all out for her. Said if she didn't stop that infernal banging night and day, I'd chop up her piano for firewood. She got the drift. Never tickled ivory again, did she?" He laughed. "Almost regret it now, for all my peace and quiet. Tracy's been meddling in politics ever since." Desdemona glanced at Chaz, met his provocative gaze dead on, and murmured, "Indeed, one might say the Women's Enfranchisement Act... one might say the Women's Enfranchisement Act is all Daddy's fault." "What was that?" her father asked sharply. Letting her long lashes veil her eyes, Desdemona smiled lazily and shrugged her naked golden shoulders. "Nothing of consequence, Snookums, as usual." "And will dear Tracy be joining us for any of your birthday celebrations, Desdemona?" Lupe inquired. Her coal-lined, basset-hound brown eyes were, Elliot thought, without any real curiosity or concern. She was secure in H.H.'s affections, such as they were. "Mother sends her regrets," Desdemona replied airily, along with a birthday card that she and Aunt Audrey and all the rest of the suffragist sisterhood signed, wishing me a fine year full of groundbreaking improvements to child labor laws. She smiled jaw-breakingly around the room, her black eyes glittering away. That, Elliot thought, that's the smile I want to paint. Until even the Countess had to look away, smiling vaguely. "I believe I shall drive into town to do some shopping tomorrow before the big night." "Oh, I love shopping," Desdemona gushed. "Chaz promised me a birthday spree, didn't you, Chazzy darling? Anything I wanted, you said." Yes, anything," Chaz yawned. "But really, Desi, what with your execrable taste in designer gowns, I'm not sure we shouldn't sign some kind of agreement beforehand, detailing which shops you're allowed to visit." This promised an amiable tiff, and Desdemona and Chaz put their heads together to enjoy it, while Lupe and H.H. drifted away for some private conversation. Elliot hesitated before joining Gideon by the fireplace. The others had all elected unanimously to ignore him, his ruined suit and his rude behavior, but that was the last thing Elliot wanted to do. Grab him by the shoulders, yes. Shake him. Knock him to the floor, yes. His fingers kept curling into fists. He ironed them flat against his thighs. Physical violence would never move one such as Gideon, and it would only make Elliot sick. Gideon was leaning against the mantel, one trembling hand raised to cover his eyes. Feeling Elliot's scrutiny, he dropped his hand back to his side and glanced up. How gray Gideon looked, how weary, as if he had aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. "Howl," said Gideon, in a voice so soft it lured Elliot closer despite himself. When he was an arm's length away, Gideon reached out and laid his palm against Elliot's face. Elliot inhaled sharply, leaned in. Gideon rarely touched anyone. Now Elliot knew why. "If Anna tries to go..." Now Gideon set his forehead against Elliot's, pressed close, whispered, "Don't stop her, please. I'll make it up to her, I promise, but this place, it's bad for people like her. For you too, Howl. But for all your dreams and visions, you are anchored to this world. You are committed to changing it, one painting at a time, until all its walls fall down. Anna plays the sturdy farm girl, this role she was born into, but who is she fooling? People like Countess Valeska? Pierce that rural facade, and Anna's internal landscape is wind and fire." Shuddering, Gideon stepped back from Elliot. "Breaker House will open its mouth to her if she stays, and she will fall to the very bottom and be swallowed." "Midnight is the breaking hour. Any door will do." Elliot's vision washed blue-black, eyes, wings, claws. "Gideon," he said tightly, "I don't understand you when you talk like this. Say what you mean." He frowned at the strain on Gideon's brow and added, "If you can." Gideon pinched the bridge of his nose as if gating a migraine. "I've crossed into the veil, you know? And I've returned. But you never really return, do you?" He held up his hands. Beneath the crust of plaster, his skin bubbled with blisters. The calluses on his fingers cracked and bleeding. They don't let you go. Remember that. Who, Gideon? Elliot pressed him. He knew, of course he knew, but he wanted to hear it. He needed Gideon to say the words. Who doesn't let you go? Ducking his head, so that his dark curls fell over his eyes, Gideon shoved his hands into his trouser pockets. His voice, when next he spoke, was clipped and nonchalant. I'm for bed, Howell. Make my excuses, will you? My suit's wrecked, and I'm not hungry. You're never hungry, Elliot whispered. Anna's the only one who can make you eat. Gideon's burning black gaze seared into him. I would eat from her hand like a dog. He left the room without another word. And that's the end of that chapter, and that's the end of today's stream. I'm sorry I got started a little late. Thank you for listening, whoever you are, wherever you are, whenever you're listening. Remember that Dark Breakers is available as a hardcover and paperback to purchase wherever books are sold, but especially from its publisher, Mythic Delirium, mythicdelirium.com, I think, or org, one of those two. Google it. Mike Allen is the publisher. And then if you're interested in Desdemona Mannering, whom you now met a few times in these chapters, she has her own standalone novella published by what had been Tor.com, now Reactor, called Desdemona and the Deep. And that's available as a paperback, and it's also available as an audiobook that I narrated way back in 2019. So that was nice. Okay, well, that's all my announcements for today. I will be back next Tuesday with more, and by this week I will upload these to YouTube, but for now they should be available on Twitch. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.